So in GameMaker, you have these things called functions, and functions are just bits of code. If I'm gonna type in the code editor, and you can write them once, and you can call them from anywhere in your program as many times as you like, so that you don't have to duplicate code. DRY, the principle, don't repeat yourself, is the basis of functions, and they can take arguments, they can return values, they can do operations. Those are functions. We know what functions are. You also have methods. I'm just going to define a struct real quick. A constructor like this. And methods are essentially just functions which belong to instances of structs or instances of GameMaker objects. You can also use them with GameMaker objects. They work pretty much the same. Other than that, you can give them parameters, and you can have them do things and return values. The difference is the scope that they run in. If you were to this method here belongs to these structs, instances of these structs. And if you were to run the method using the dot operator on the instance of the struct, then the scope of the code that this is running in will be set to this instance. It's very much like using the with control statement in classic GameMaker, where you could use with on an instance ID or on an object and have the code run in the scope of that object. This isn't anything new so far, but there's also the matter of, and I can't believe that Yo-Yo Games actually had the brawn to call it this, there's also the matter of the method function. It doesn't matter how many times I say that out loud, it still sounds just as wrong as it always did. Hello all you crazy people out there, my name is Michael, I like wizards and dragons and making games. Let's talk about the method function. So there are a few ways you can define a method. Let me just get rid of most of this. There are a few ways you can define a method. One is like this, one is in a struct constructor. You can also use an instance's create event. I'm not going to do that right now, but this does also work with instance create events. I am going to change this up slightly to make it work a little bit better with the example that I'm going to use in this video. Let's have a constructor for a struct called person, and it'll take a name as a parameter to its constructor. And instead of just a generic "this is a method" which just adds three numbers together, we will say we're going to have a method called speak. I'm going to capitalize that because I like C#, and C# likes to capitalize methods. We are going to give this person constructor struct a method called speak, and it's just going to show message my own name. We can give this we can pass this a name. Yeah, that's his name. And then we can just call the speak method. And this is going to, when we run the speak method, this is going to show message our name in a little message box. That's fine. That's a method. And you can see, like I said before, like I said earlier, that when you do this, the scope of this code that's running in the speak method is set to this instance of the struct, which you are using the dot operator on. And it's equivalent to this code with the instance. You can call the method, or you can run the code or whatever, and you can do it without. Let me at least comment this out. You can do this without having to use the dot operator, because the with statement basically does the same thing in shifting the scope of the code that's running. I don't find myself doing that very much anymore since 2.3 came out, and since we now have methods that we can use in GameMaker. So there's another way that you can create a method in GameMaker. I'm gonna call this P1, just so that it's not like a random letter value. We're gonna say P2, and that is using what I like to call anonymous structs. You can create structs without needing a constructor. What's another name? We can assign a variable using the colon. We can assign a method using the colon as well. This is basically almost JSON format. It's not quite GML. Although the code within a function definition will be will be GML. You can do the same thing in this format. Let's see. Is there something that shouldn't be there? No, the syntax checker was just taking a moment to catch up. So we can say person1.speak, person2.speak. They're going to work the same way. And John Blunt, King George, so on down the line. Fans of English history may know where I'm going with this example. You can also do this with regular GameMaker instances. Regular GameMaker instances can have methods of their own, just like structs can, but I'm not going to demonstrate that now. I've already made videos on methods in the past. Now, all these methods really are, at their core, are functions which are stored in a variable. Or if you flip it on its head, they're variables which contain functions. And GameMaker is a dynamic language, which means that you can do some fun things such as var p3 is going to equal, let's just make this a regular struct. Who are some of the other people at play in the this little point in history? If I'm remembering correctly. So if we create a person3 and call person3.speak on it, of course it's not actually going to do anything, it's just going to break when it gets there, because speak has not been defined for the struct. It contains no definition for speak. It contains no constructor with it. We didn't give it one when we created the JSON-like thing, anonymous struct. But of course, since GML is a dynamic language, if you wanted to, you could say p3.speak. It's going to equal function. And you can define a new function. You can refer to an old function. It doesn't matter. Show message self.name. However, this is not going to work exactly the way that we want it to. And we've got John Blunt, King George, and we've got an error because name has not been set before reading it, apparently. Even though, as of our current understanding of how GML works, it should be, because we are basically creating a method. We are creating a function and putting it in the speak variable, and then calling it later on the next line. Except that's not entirely how this works. So the scoping rules in GameMaker, and you know what? Let me do this. I can hear Carl like screaming over my shoulder the longer I don't do this. But I'm just gonna game end in the step event, drag that object into the room, and now if it doesn't crash, the game is just gonna end automatically without me having to close it like that. So the scoping rules in GameMaker are a little bit weird. So unlike in some languages, when you call a function that is stored in a variable that belongs to an instance of something using the dot operator like this, it does not automatically set the scope of the code that's running to the object or instance that you call the dot operator on. This being just any old regular variable which may contain a function, it may contain a number, it may contain a string. In GML, you are allowed to just store functions in variables. So if I were to say some function is equal to a function, and let's just say it does something like that, I can call the function which is stored in this variable. I'm going to comment out everything that I did before this just so that we can come back to it later without having it getting in the way now. We can call this function. We can redefine the function that's, we can assign another function to this variable. We can say some function now equals another different function. Like that. And we are going to see that when we run this code, it's going to first show us the first message, and then it's going to be redefined to the other function that's showing us the second message. And these are just variables that happen to contain functions. And the same is true when it comes to variables that belong to structs, or which belong to GameMaker instances. I've really got to stop saying both of those things because it kind of slows the pace of the video down. So this p3.speak is just a variable which contains a function. It does not contain any special information which tells the GameMaker virtual machine that it needs to set the scope of the code to this instance the way that a method does, the way that you might expect it to. But the difference has to do with the fact that these assignments in which we are creating the method, this code is running in the same scope as the instance itself. And therefore, when we say speak equals this function, the code is running in the instance of the struct, in the instance of P1 or whatever we're instantiating. And GameMaker knows that, and it tells this variable that it should become a method, and that it should run in the scope of this instance, which is currently being created by the constructor. The same thing is happening down here in the P2 struct for King George. It's a little bit different because it's harder to make the claim that this code is running in the scope of P2 because it's anonymous structs are kind of not things until after they've been created. They kind of don't exist until the end of the definition. But nevertheless, GameMaker sees this and said that the function which is being stored in this variable called speak, that's a method that is bound to this instance, and it should run in the scope of this instance when you call it with the dot operator. For P3 down here, for Robert Knight, that is not the case. This assignment, p3.speak equals function, this is not running in the scope of P3 itself. This is just running in the global scope of this script, which is running. If you were to do this somewhere else in the code, it would be running in whatever the scope of whatever other object or creation code or whatever. And GameMaker sees this and it says, nope, that is not a method. That is just a function which you happen to be storing in a variable. And when it assigns it to the variable, it does not give it any of the special method information which tells it to run in the scope of the struct. It's just literally stuffing the function into the variable. And then when you call it later down here on the next line, you just call the function. You are not setting the scope to that of P3 as you would with these other two structs up here. GameMaker looks for self.name, which does not exist. It throws its hands in the air and just completely gives up entirely. Now with the method function, I'm sorry, I just cannot get over that name, the method function. With the method function, you can go around this and you can avoid this issue, and you can assign a function to a variable belonging to a struct, which has its scope set to that struct, and then that would allow you to call it just like any other method without further complication. So before I continue, a bit of a warning: this is not what some people would consider good code. If you are just reassigning or assigning methods to variables and instances on the fly like this, it can make your code kind of, shall we say, spaghetti and kind of hard to read, and it can lead to weird errors happening if you think code is running in the scope of one struct or instance or whatever, and instead it's running in the scope of something else. It can be very useful. It can be a very useful thing to want to do, but if you're not paying attention, if you're not careful, it can lead to some unusual issues. So before you do this kind of thing, make sure that you know exactly what code you're editing and what you're doing to the game, and try to be aware of what sort of complications it might lead to further on down the line. Without further ado, the method function. So I'm going to just move that down there for now. If you've ever tried to create a method that's literally just called method, which I believe I have tried to do on video before and failed because method is a function name which is already reserved and you can't redefine it yourself. If you type it out in the code editor, you will see that it takes two arguments. You'll see that it takes a struct reference or an instance ID as well as a function. At least you can safely assume that FUNC is short for function. The struct reference or instance ID is fairly straightforward. It is just whatever instance of the struct or the GameMaker object that you want to bind the function to, that you want the function to belong to. In 99.99999% of cases, you are going to just use the GameMaker instance or struct instance or whatever that you are trying to assign the method to. So in this case, it's P3. It's person 3. We are assigning this function as a method to person 3 to Robert Knight. Our struct reference or instance ID is just going to be P3. I'll get back to that in a minute. And the function is the function that you want to turn into a method. So you can use one of these anonymous functions, as I like to call them, and you can just type the function body into the argument. You can just type it directly into the argument like this. This will work. If I run the game now, we're going to see John Blunt, King George, and Robert Knight working as intended. This could also just be a function that's somewhere else. You could define this somewhere else. If we say function speak my name, let's give it a different function name just so that it doesn't get confused with the actual speak method. If you define the function somewhere else, you could just put the function reference into the method function. second parameter, and it will also work. John Blunt, King George, and Robert Knight, again, does the same thing. If you wanted this to be stored in some other variable like this, as your alternative way of defining functions, you can do that as well. Although do be warned that you need to define the variable before you try to actually access it. Whereas defining functions the other way, the function name would just be global, and it doesn't matter where you define it or if the code ever runs or anything. John Blunt, King George, Robert Knight. That's fine. That's the method function. It's pretty straightforward. I don't know why this video has been going on for, what, like 15 minutes now? So this code here, in and of itself, isn't so bad. But I did specifically go out of my way to not say that 100% of the time, the struct reference or instance ID that you will want to use will be the same one that you were trying to assign to, so P3, whatever it happens to be. And that is because you don't actually have to do that. You can use any other struct reference or instance ID as the method, as the thing that you're binding the method to in the first argument of the method function. And if you do this, you are going to find your code may get very out of hand very quickly. So if you think that we're going to see all three names appearing once, John Blunt, King George, you would be wrong, because we're just going to see King George again, because despite the fact that this method is stored in p3.speak, it is contained by Robert Knight, by the Robert Knight struct. That is not the instance that it's actually pointing to when it comes to the scope that is set by the method. The instance that it's pointing to set the scope to is the one that we specified up here, which is p2. I do not recommend doing this, and I say that as someone who does use code like this from time to time on his own, for his own purposes. There are some practical reasons for that which are not particularly relevant to this video. I'm just going to say, unless you're a GameMaker power user who really, really knows your way around the code really well, don't do this, because it is a very good way to make your code very difficult to read and follow very quickly. And if you do this, you can and will find bugs popping up that have to do with things not running in the scope that you think they're running in. But those of you who have been around my YouTube channel for a long time know that I am not one to shy away from weird pieces of GML. So we can make this even worse. In this case, P2 is a struct that already exists. If you were to do it for P1, you would have John Blunt showing up twice. P1 is a struct which already exists. P3, obviously, person 3 is just what you probably normally want to do, which is a reference to the struct which is actually going to own this method. All these three structs already exist, but if you want to, and believe me, you do not actually want to do this, you can, instead of using a struct which already exists, you can create a struct, and it can be completely anonymous. There can be no other references to it in the code, but if you were to just use a JSON notation, or a constructor if you would like, and you were to assign it a name, this is a legitimate GameMaker struct. This is a legitimate struct. It contains a single property, which is just the name. It contains a single variable, Robert Walpole. We are now binding the speakMyName method to that struct, which has been created and which is referenced nowhere else in the code. And if I were to run the game now, John Blunt, King George, Robert Walpole. Again, this struct exists nowhere else in the game. There are no other ways to access this. Well, is there? Method get self. You can technically access this with method get self if you were to show message method get self p3.speak, something like this. You would be able to see the struct that this is bound to. Don't do this. This is not going to help you any. If you're this far down the rabbit hole, you can see that we are technically able to get a reference to that struct. Don't do that. This is spaghetti code. And also, while we're at it, method get index is a way to get the actual function out of a method. 100005, that just happens to be the ID of the function rather than the method itself. Anyway, I'm pretty sure I've just given about 20 minutes of ammunition to everybody who's ever said that GML is a terrible programming language, scripting language, if you're someone who cares to make the distinction. Anyway, I'm going to stop here. Now you know how the method function works. Whether or not you should actually use the method function is up for you to decide.
I can teach you, but I won't be held responsible for what you do with the knowledge.
I haven't played that clip in months, but I think I'm allowed just for situations that are as ridiculous as this. Anyway, my name is Michael, this has been the Method Function. This whole video may or may not have just been an excuse for an extra history fan to make a very elaborate "it was Walpole" joke. I hope you all found that interesting, and I will see you all later. Special thanks to Kiara Elizabeth, Connor, David Key, Edward Holt, Emily Koyo, Posho, and Zenith for supporting these videos. If you want to see your name in the credits or to hear yourself shouted out at the end, head on over to the Patreon page in the video description to join the fun.